Now, Vontaze Burfict recently met with the NFL and Roger Goodell saying, quote, "I met Commissioner Goodell in New York and he was a total blank. The meeting to review Burfict's season-long suspension was bull blank. He already had the suspension in his hand." So Jordan, I turn to you now. Vontaze Burfict's done for the season after that hit on Colts tight end Jack Doyle. And Myles Garrett, as we saw Thursday night, ripped off Mason Rudolph's helmet, smacked him on the head with it, and he's also suspended indefinitely. So what are our reactions here to the NFL's new stance on how they deal with players in these situations and player safety as a whole?
Well, I personally believe that Vontaze Burfict is someone that had it coming for him after he is a repeat offender of multiple league violations, whether I believe it was a substance abuse policy and multiple game ejections for dirty hits in the past. We all know the one that comes to mind in the playoff game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, the leaning of the helmet headshot, the dirty hit on Antonio Brown a couple of years ago, and it lost in the playoff game. So, yeah, I think personally with the Vontaze Burfict situation, they handled it absolutely perfectly because if you look at the hit on Jack Doyle, a lot of people seem to argue that he was making a football play, and I feel like that hit maybe didn't warrant the rest of the season. That was probably a one-game hit, but if you combine it with all of the other offenses that Vontaze Burfict has committed throughout his career, I think that's warranted. And as for Myles Garrett, in 17 years of watching football, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. I don't care that Mason Rudolph said anything or did anything, happened to kick him in the area you don't want to be kicked, or tried to grab his helmet off and put his hand inside his face mask. Myles Garrett is 6'5" and 280 pounds, and he's holding a deadly weapon in his hand. And for a league that advocates player safety so much because they're facing lawsuits constantly, it's not a good PR look at all. So I think the NFL did the complete right thing, suspending him indefinitely, and I wouldn't be surprised if this suspension were to continue into next season.
You know, it's really interesting. You hear the NFL talking about players should never use their helmets as a weapon. And you think of that when they're making a football play, right? Like using their helmet to initiate contact. And here we are with a player Thursday night literally taking off his opponent's helmet and literally using it as a weapon. It's completely ridiculous. And look, I know Mason Rudolph instigated a little bit. And I know, he kicked it in a little area that you probably shouldn't have, and things got a little testy. But at the end of the day, Myles Garrett put Mason Rudolph in a dangerous situation. And Myles Garrett is suspended indefinitely. But let's be real. If there was more damage or more consequence, more injury to Mason Rudolph, then the punishment for Myles Garrett would be even greater. I mean, if Mason Rudolph, this is a guy who was knocked out on a football play just a few short weeks ago, and now Myles Garrett's swinging at Mason Rudolph with the helmet. So what if Mason Rudolph was knocked out again? Myles Garrett would be out of the league probably forever.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the NFL's stance on this because we know they've been very for player safety in the past few years, and that's what they've been pushing for. And I think it's interesting because, Myles Garrett, of course, there's no place for that on a football field, but things like Vontaze Burfict, if we're just talking about that one hit this season, which technically we are just talking about that one hit, the NFL a decade ago would never have made a punishment like this. Yeah. And I think that's just something interesting to monitor because they've been so high on player safety, but to see them actually stay true to their word is something the NFL hasn't really done a whole lot in past years when it comes to the Players Association and players and punishments and things like that. So I think it's good that they're sticking to their word, and it's good to see, that they're following through.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And one thing that I found interesting that Louis Riddick actually said yesterday on ESPN's First Take. Louis Riddick's a very well-respected guy. He played in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was also vice president of player personnel for the Philadelphia Eagles in the beginning of this decade. So he's seen it from both perspectives. He's been an executive. He's been a player. He's been part of scouting teams and coaching staff. He knows the game really, really well. He said back when he played with players that were revered. He played with the Derek Brookses of the world, the Warren Sapps, And the game was much more brutal back then, and it was much different in the sense that there wasn't these ridiculous roughing the passer penalties, and there wasn't these rules in place for player safety. And basically what he said, he played in a time where the game was much tougher and much dirtier, and he said even in that time, with all of those great defensive players, that their goal was to go out there and make you think twice about going anywhere near them. They wanted to hit you hard. He said not only have they ever seen anything like that, but they would never, ever condone what Myles Garrett did on Thursday night. And I think that speaks volumes to the severity of his actions.
Yeah, and just one last note on Myles Garrett. Look, your team's up 2 possessions, 21-7. They won the game. There's 8 seconds left on the clock. That's it.
Game over.
Game over. And he goes in, makes a late play on Mason Rudolph. So, of course, Rudolph's frustrated, and whether him trying to pull off Garrett's helmet or kick him you-know-where was warranted, Garrett made a late play. And his team's up 2 possessions, and it's the Cleveland Browns, so look, the Cleveland Browns are now 4-6, and they're looking more real than they have all season. But instead of the story being their win now on Thursday night, the story is Myles Garrett swinging at Mason Rudolph. And whether what Rudolph did to instigate was right or wrong, you should know if you're Myles Garrett in that situation. 8 seconds left on the clock. Game over. Why are you causing problems so late in the game, especially if you're on the Cleveland Browns, who are the most talked about team in the NFL this season?